You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to Filmmaking Conversations with Damian Swaby. Listen to conversations with award-winning filmmakers, directors from the golden age of television, and creatives from the indie film community who continue to inspire the next generation of filmmakers. And now, over to your host, Damian Swaby.
Hi, Paul. How are you today?
Hi, Damian. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for coming on. I was really excited to hear from your people for us to do this podcast, because we're going to talk about a topic that I've wanted to speak about for quite a while, if I'm honest. So I'm glad you're here, and we'll get into that topic during the course of the podcast, of course. But before we do, I'd love to know how you got your career started in scripted and factual TV. You've had a diverse career producing both scripted and factual TV, and how you approach the different challenges presented by these two formats.
Oh, thank you. Well, to start, I can tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am now in my career. I started quite a while ago working in independent film in New York City. I live and work in New York City, although often out of the city now. And so, very, very long time ago, I just took a first job as a production assistant on a very small indie film. I was in graduate school at the time, and I fell in love with working on film sets. And I very quickly moved up to the position of assistant director, which you may well know, but if you don't, is basically the stage manager or the conductor of a production crew. And, TV shows and films of all sizes almost always will have an assistant director. And the AD works closely with the actual director and with the cinematographer to make sure everything on set is happening as quickly and efficiently and safely as possible, and is overall responsible for making sure the production stays on schedule and everything is going as well as it can. And of course, the assistant director also works with the production and with the producers, with the same end in mind. And it can be kind of a liaison in a way between what's actually happening right on the set around the camera with the actors and the director and the DP versus what the production itself is doing, and making sure everybody knows what the next shot is, what the next scene is, what we're doing after lunch, what we're doing tomorrow, what we're doing next week. So I did that for a while. I did that for probably about 15 years. And I got the opportunity to start working in factual TV in what's now a kind of a legendary factual show called The Men Who Built America. And that was produced by a company in New York for the History Channel back in 2011. It aired in 2011. And since then, this franchise of The Men Who Built America has really just kept going and going and going with all these spin-offs and sequels, including, the cars that built America and the tycoons that built America and the food that built America and the toys that built America. So it really turned out to be this really super successful factual franchise that kind of keeps going on to this day. On that show, I was also the assistant director. So I brought all this filmmaking expertise I had to the shoot, which was quite valuable, I think, to the production, because the project heavily depended on dramatic recreations to tell these stories of 19th century business tycoons like Andrew Carnegie and Cornelius Vanderbilt. And so I brought the sense of, we're going to run this like a movie to the show. And we did these very elaborate, very, very, very well produced and lavish dramatizations for the show. And again, I just made them work like a movie would, and it was very successful. And so from there, I just kind of kept moving in the direction of factual. Relatively soon after that, I got the chance to work as a story producer, which is a combination of writer and producer that works mostly in post-production, working with the editors and the producers and the director in the edit of factual shows. So I worked as a story producer on a show called Gunslingers, which was a pretty successful Old West outlaw show, a docudrama series for a network called American Heroes Channel in the United States. And then after that, I got the chance to produce and direct a few episodes of the second season, and it really just kept going from there. And I've had a lot of opportunities over the years, building one on top of the other, to keep working almost entirely in factual in various ways. I spent a couple years working in the long form unit at NBC News. So I was working at Rockefeller Plaza in New York City, and I did a few shows for them. And it was really, that was a very, very fun place to work. And I was I never ever got tired of just arriving at 30 Rock and being in the environment and being able to go to the MSNBC broadcast floors and seeing, occasionally seeing Saturday Night Live talent walking around the building. It's a really fascinating, fabulous place. It's as close as we get to like a big movie studio environment as we have in New York City. So I did a couple years of that. I started working on a show called Into the Wild Frontier, which is a factual historical show, a docudrama format about America's early frontier era and about these iconic frontiersmen and mountain men who helped, discover from the American point of view and open and explore the American West from the 1820s on to the 1850s. And that show has gone a total of 4 seasons. We filmed the last season, season 4, last year over the summer in Montana. And I was the showrunner of seasons 1 and 2. And I was an EP, executive producer on season 3. And on season 4, I was a co-executive producer and also the dramatizations director of the series.
Amazing. You've done a lot of great stuff.
I've done a lot. And then most recently was Tall Tales of Jim Bridger, a scripted show, fully scripted show about a real American frontiersman named Jim Bridger, who was very, very active and somewhat famous in his own time in the 1900s. And that was for INSP Network. And again, fully scripted show, half-hour drama. And so I really have covered quite a lot of ground. True crime, current events, pop science. I spent 5 days in Chernobyl for a series. I did an episode about Chernobyl. This is before the Russian war. I've done quite a bit of Old West lately. I've really done almost everything one can do in factual, maybe with the exception of like food shows and home flipping, home reno. I haven't really done that kind of thing, but everything else I've at least tried once or twice.
Are food shows something that you're interested in doing? Like a new version of Man versus Food or something crazy? Or
I would be interested in doing a food show. It would really depend upon the topic. Food, it can be fascinating. Food is something that everybody is constantly focused on. I think a really interesting food show transcends really just the food itself and gets to talk about bigger cultural issues, bigger social issues, talks about the way people interact with each other over meals, how food influences the way we think and behave and feel. So a bigger idea food show, and there are plenty of them, I think would be great. I would certainly jump at the chance to work on something like that.
And with all your experience, it's clear you must have great ideas regarding managing production budgets. Managing production budgets is critical in a lot of people's roles. And how do you balance the financial constraints with the creative demands of a project?
So when it comes to managing budgets, and my role as a showrunner, for the most part, I have an indirect control over the budget. For any given show, a factual drama, a factual series, the production company and the network will decide upon what the budget will be. And usually somebody from the company, a producer or a line producer, will do the actual line out of the budget. And I'll try to influence that based on what the creative need of the show is. But I don't do very much work directly on the budget of, trying to get better deals on rentals. I don't negotiate with cast for their rates. I don't negotiate fees for locations and things. I just try to make sure that as the showrunner and the person who's shaping the creative idea of the entire show, that the budget accurately reflects what we're trying to do with the show. And so with the case of the Old West docudrama, I'll try to make sure that the budget recognizes, we're going to have to do some shootouts. We'll need an armorer. We're going to have some stagecoach work. So we'll need to make sure we can cost effectively rent a stagecoach for as many days as, we can that fits into the budget. And so it's really more of a matter of push and pull with the budget. Usually it's not acrimonious. Usually it's not difficult, because I always come from a place of budget scarcity, coming from independent films. I've really never been on a project where money is no object. I've done some work as a production assistant, really big productions, but I've never been the showrunner of a really big production where the idea is make it awesome, make it big. The money will take care of itself. Some shows are like that. For me, it's always been, we want the show to look big. We want the show to be really exciting. We want it to be very dramatic, but the budget's very small. So how do we reconcile that? So for me, the budget management comes down to what's the best way to tell the story of the series in the most cost-effective way to make the most value out of the budget that we do have available. And that comes down to probably two things. The first and most important thing is not try to bite off more than you can chew. Don't try to do things in the show that you know are just not going to be affordable to the budget. So if we were going to do a Titanic documentary, for example, I would approach that with quite a bit of caution and say, what story about the Titanic can we tell that doesn't really involve diving on the Titanic? Our budget's not going to afford that. We're not going to be able to build really extensive sets and do really extensive work that recreates the idea of the ship sinking, maybe in extremely impressionistic ways or stylistic ways where it's all very moody and dark and shadowy, and take a very elegant and clever stylistic approach to it. But we're not going to get close to doing Titanic. So if we're going to do the story, what's the story we're trying to tell? And how do we make it compelling and irresistible, but without saying that we're going to have to build a mini Titanic and sink it? That model would apply to almost every kind of show that you would do. For Old West shows, which I've been doing recently, there's a lot of big events in the Old West. There are massive buffalo hunts where people are hunting buffalo, and the buffalo herd might number millions and millions of animals. So with AI and CGI and VFX and that kind of thing, you can recreate a buffalo hunt or a buffalo herd pretty well. But what you can't really do is the high intensity action component of your main character galloping into the middle of an active buffalo herd in the way you might have seen in a movie like Dances with Wolves. So how do we tell that story, but without saying, hey, we have to, go to a place where there's a sizable buffalo herd and do what amounts to an action sequence of stunt performers riding into the middle of it? With true crime does quite a lot of dramatic reenactment, and the results vary. The kind of classic bread and butter crime of the week show from the early 2000s and mid 2000s, even from 2010 onward, the kinds of shows you might see on Discovery ID or Oxygen, a staple of the show is reenactments, and they usually don't have very much budget. And so the trick is, how do we stage a scene in a disco or in a crowded bar without having the resources to actually fill a disco or a club or a crowded bar? How do we make it look like our characters are in a place where there's hundreds of people and there really aren't? And so there's always going to be a challenge of how do we tell the most effective story to serve the series, to serve the project, versus how do we compare that with the budget that's available? And again, the two things are, first and foremost, don't try to do more than your budget will allow. Be cognizant, be realistic about what the size of your budget is. And the second thing is, this is where your creative instincts kick in. This is where your cleverness as a filmmaker, as a producer, as a director kick in. How do I make the small thing that we can afford look like the big thing? And that just comes down to style and carefully marshaling the resources, knowing where to put the camera, knowing how to repeat background actors, how to repeat action. Really, very important part of it is, what's the location going to be? If you can only afford one location, how do you make sure you can get 3 or 4 more looks out of it? So choosing the location is going to be a big deal. And then just being as smart as you can on the shoot day. Let's move quickly. Let's decide ahead of time what we're going to try to accomplish. Let's have a good plan coming into it and try to execute the plan as fast as possible.
Excellent. I couldn't agree more. That's a vital, great information and advice you've just given there. But Paul, can you elaborate on how the Rush trial has influenced Hollywood's stance on set safety, particularly regarding the use of real firearms versus special effects? At what point does budget affect that situation too?
If we're talking about the Rust tragedy, it's difficult to talk about it without recognizing the effect that the project's budget almost certainly had on it. A lot of the attention of the story has focused on the experience level and the responsibility level of the show's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, who was convicted of manslaughter for her role in the situation a few months ago. And what is often pointed out, but perhaps is not fully recognized by people paying attention or who don't work in the industry, is she effectively had 2 jobs on that production. She was the film's armorer, but she was either, depending on who you ask, the prop master or the assistant prop master. Now, the armorer and the prop master are typically done by 2 different people, and often by 2 different departments of people. And so the idea that one person is filling both roles is problematic right off the bat, because the armorer's role is so closely tied to safety. The idea that the person filling that role also has responsibilities not related to it just means that that person's attention and their level of awareness and their functional bandwidth is going to be split between two things. So I feel like the production probably made an error, and not out of a sense of maliciousness or any ill intent or ill will or anything. It's hard to know what the thinking of the producers and the production was when they made these kinds of decisions. And I'm not privy to that. I don't know them personally. I don't have any really inside look into the situation. But when you start with the situation that the armorer also had another job on the set, and the producers and the production probably made that decision out of budget considerations, thinking, hey, we can pay just one person instead of paying two people, that points a finger directly at a budget consideration. And then there have been constant reporting about the show, about the project, having a hurried and hasty and urgent sensibility to it. Always a sense of trying to move faster, always an urgency about staying on schedule, always a sense of trying to get things done as quickly as possible. And that is also a function of budget. I've been on plenty of low-budget independent films of about that size. I actually have been the assistant director of Western projects on the exact same filming location, and I've even stood in that role in the exact same set of the church in New Mexico where this tragedy occurred. I've shot many days in the exact same place. I know exactly what the assistant director of that show was going through. I've been as literally in that person, in David Hall's shoes as one could be. And I know what it feels like when there is an urgency from the production to move quickly and get things done as fast as possible. And for the love of God, don't go into overtime, and don't make us go over the schedule. And that kind of urgency can only come at the expense of doing things thoughtfully, and in this case, doing things safely. And so that's a big problem, I think, when it comes to certain kinds of low budget productions. Not all of them by any means. And I wouldn't want to say that, by definition, an indie film or a low budget project or anything like that is by definition unsafe or risky, because they're certainly not. But when it comes to talking about low budget projects or indie films or low budget productions in general, the lower the budget, the more likelihood there is for risk factors to become more acute. And again, it's because they're always coming from a place of not having as much time as they probably would want or should need, but still trying to accomplish an entire film shoot in a limited amount of time. So I think the idea of, to sum it up, there's probably very difficult to separate the idea of the Rush tragedy versus the impetus of low budget filmmaking or an independent film. These two things overlap each other in ways I think that are impossible to separate.
Do you think that the manslaughter charge was appropriate?
I think the conviction for manslaughter of Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, the armorer of the film Rust, was appropriate based on everything I've been able to read and understand about what happened on that day and about what happened in the days leading up to the shoot, frankly. And based on my own experience in low budget productions as an assistant director largely responsible for safety on set, it does seem like the armorer acted irresponsibly, and the armorer could have and should have done more things to make sure that the tragedy did not take place. But I think it's too easy to simply say that the responsibility ends with Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. She wasn't operating in a vacuum, and she wasn't making all the choices on the set completely on her own. And she might not have had the ability to influence safety factors and risk factors as much as she would have wanted to on that show. And I think that this responsibility probably spreads out to some degree to David Halls, the assistant director, but that is something we should talk about. But also out to the rest of the production at large. What I have noticed in most of the reporting about the Rust tragedy, most of the reporting talks about Alec Baldwin, and talks about Hannah Gutierrez-Smith, the armorer, and it talks about David Halls, the assistant director. But the film's line producer or the production manager or the other producers are really never mentioned. And all of those people have areas of responsibility for the safe running of a set that overlap the people that are mentioned all the time. And I don't certainly want to say that any of those people have responsibility for the tragedy that they have been held accountable for. But the fact that they're not really mentioned in the conversation, I think, is quite telling, because it's not 100% up to the assistant director to make sure things are run safely. The assistant director's role is very commonly considered the safety monitor on set, but their person's ability to actually fulfill that role is a lot more limited than I think people think. And in case of the armorer is the same thing, is really considered responsible for the safe operation, handling an operation by the firearms. And they certainly are responsible. But full safety on the set, when it comes to the use of firearms, is not 100% vested in the armorer. The armorer can only do so many things to make sure the set is safe, but there are certain things that are going to be out of that person's control. And so I think these are parts of the conversation that really have not been had yet about the tragedy at large.
What changes do you foresee in production safety protocols as a result of the Rust trial?
As a result of the Rust trial, I feel that there are going to be some changes in set safety, but probably nothing that is dramatic or universal or that's going to fundamentally change the way firearms are used on set, not in the foreseeable future. I think the main change, we've probably already felt it, and I certainly know I've felt it working on my production since the Rust trial, is a greater focus on the risks on set, and particularly when it comes to gun use. And I know a lot of productions have decided to simply forego using blank rounds and doing live action gun firing on sets in favor of visual effects. They just decided it's probably just as easy and cost effective to do that. That might actually increase as time passes, as the cost threshold and the quality of the visual effects to replicate actual gunshots increases. Right now, I personally, as a director, as a key creative, I don't think those visual effects are effective enough. I don't think that they really convey the energy and impact of gunfire in shootouts or guns being shot in scenes. I don't think that they replicate the effect of the actual thing, in the sense that the actors will always respond to it. They'll always react in a certain way. The firearm will always move in a certain way. The noise will always make a certain noise that can be replicated, but it takes a little bit of effort. Smoke, muzzle flash, a shell casing coming out if there is one. These things can be replicated. So far, they're not always as realistic as the real thing. And as a bit of a purist, I want them to feel real, because particularly when it comes to the actors, I want the actors to feel they're firing a real firearm, if that's what the scene calls for. And if they're simply faking it, it's very difficult to give the same just visceral reaction to the pulling of the trigger. But I do think productions are going to move in that direction. There's certainly no shortage of talk about what is AI going to do to the film and TV industry. How much is it going to supplant animation and visual effects? So AI can probably help push this change along. I think, though, for the foreseeable future, there'll be plenty of productions that continue to use real firearms to fire blank rounds. And I think there's value in that. And I think what the Rust tragedy should be teaching us is we have to be more focused on doing these things safely, because they can be done safely. And we shouldn't let low budgets and a hurried schedule and a sense of urgency and haste coming from various producers and cast members and perhaps the director on set shortchange the safety protocols that are in place.
To ensure this never happens again, because this is a sad situation, can you see a new governing body being created to perhaps put regulations in place to stop something like this ever happening again?
Whether or not there'll ever be a new governing body or governing entities to prevent a future tragedy like the Rust tragedy is hard to say. In the United States, we don't respond well to regulatory agencies, frankly. When it comes to firearms overlap a much, much bigger issue in the United States that go far beyond their use in film set. I probably don't need to explain that very much, although I'm answer any questions I can. But it's probably no surprise that in the United States, guns, firearms, become a much bigger thing to talk about than simply how they're used on film sets. And so I don't know if it's going to be any regulation necessarily that's going to come out relatively quickly. The other factor, though, is the cost of that. If it comes down to a third-party agency making sure that the guns are being used safely, is that a cost that would be borne by productions having to hire an approved monitor or spend money for training, or spend money for an inspector to come out from a state agency or something like that? Does that cost fall on the production? Or is that something that the state then has to start to fund and pay for offices and staff that go out and do these things? So most states in the United States, and many of them, have film incentives. They want film and TV productions to come to their states. And they want to make it easy for productions to come and film in their locations, because that there's a perception that brings a lot of economic opportunity, brings economic advantage to states. Places like Louisiana and Georgia have pretty well-known incentive programs. New Mexico has a pretty well-known incentive program where the state tries to offset as much cost as they can. So whether one of these heavy incentive states is going to say, we still want to incentivize productions to come here, we're still going to offer tax rebates, et cetera, but we now have this regulatory component about anything that has to do with gunfire on the set, that might be a disincentive for productions, because there might be costs or other kind of regulation burdens associated with that they might not want to take on. I haven't heard any sense from any of the people that talk about this that a outside regulatory entity is going to be the answer. And if it was, it would have to be probably on a state by state level, not on a federal level. And it could even be on a smaller locality level. And I think it would be wise. And I think that there is something to be said in favor of it. And I could explain what I think the value is, but I don't right now feel like that's going to be something that happens in the near future.
And if you were the director on set when the incident occurred, how would you have dealt with that? And what would you have said to Alec Baldwin?
That's a very difficult question. If I had been the director on that film, well, the director on Russ, when Hanya Hutchins was killed, he was injured badly by the same bullet. So he's actually been reported in trials and by journalists of saying, what the hell happened? What was that? That really hurts. Like things, kind of normal reactions I would imagine to catching a bullet. I don't know what you say to Alec Baldwin about that. I think it very quickly, everybody rushed to find lawyers and stake out legal positions right away. Probably the smart thing to do, beyond dealing with the emergency, the immediate health crisis, the injuries on set, frankly, the smart thing would be not to say anything until the police investigate and until charges are filed against whoever they're charged against, and the prosecution and the everything begins to take its course. So in the aftermath of the shooting, my first reaction would be, if anybody's injured, let's get them as much help as we can as fast as possible. It does seem like people in the production of Rust immediately called 911. They immediately sprang into action to get care for the people that were injured. I actually don't know, and I don't recall reading about what a set medic did or didn't do on that production. It seems kind of inconceivable that they wouldn't have had a set medic. That's a question I think I should probably figure out. But a set medic might have, if there was one, would have sprung into action, would probably have tried to, stop the bleeding, stabilize both of the victims. But of course, 911 called, emergency services were called, and both of the victims were immediately rushed to a hospital. And unfortunately, Ms. Hutchins didn't make it. So I can't imagine being in the situation that these people were in. It's a terrible and heartbreaking. And I don't know what I would have to say about it in the immediate aftermath besides call 911.
For young filmmakers, or I should say up-and-coming filmmakers that will want to maintain high safety standards on set, so this situation would never, ever happen to them, who are the governing bodies and how better can they be supported to have the knowledge to make sure they don't encounter such problems?
When it comes to up-and-coming filmmakers who are trying to make their own content, make their own projects, and wondering how to maintain safety and keep people safe on their sets, there's two things to think about. The first thing is it relates to what I was saying before about how you manage a budget. If you're making a low-budget project, a short film, online content, YouTube content, creator content, I would say to anybody up and coming, think very, very carefully and be very cautious about trying to do anything that has any risk factor besides people standing around and talking or walking around and talking. Because the smaller your budget is, and if you're talking about YouTube content creator stuff, your budget's probably micro. You probably are not going to have the resources to make sure you can hire a person experienced and competent enough to do things like gunfire. And you may not think to yourself, I need to hire a set medic. And a set medic is not necessarily a super expensive role per se, but you still need to pay for somebody to do that. And they need to be a competent person, an EMT worker or emergency responder on their off day or something like that. So if you're just shoestringing your project, the first line of defense for yourself about safety is don't try to do anything that you're not 100% confident you can do safely. The second way to look at it is a little more complicated. And this has been influencing my thinking about the Rust trial and the implications of all of it, the Rust shooting. A lot of the attention has landed on the assistant director, David Halls, as being responsible for safety on set. And to a certain degree, that is true. And having been an assistant director for a very long time, I worked on 30 to 40 movies and countless other projects as the first AD. There is a commonly held practice. It's a custom on a film set. It's an accepted practice that the assistant director is nominally responsible for safety on a film set. But, and this is a big but, the assistant director is not actually the person fully in charge of any production. He or she is usually the fourth or fifth person down the totem pole, depending on what the production is. The film's producers are ultimately responsible for the way the production is run. And then beyond that, the film's line producer or production manager, they're much more directly involved with the day-to-day. They really should be making sure that safety protocols are being followed. In many of the reports, many of the articles I've read about the Rust shooting, people hone in on the fact that David Halls, the assistant director, reportedly neglected to give safety briefings at the start of each day. And that's a pretty common practice where the assistant director gets the crew together and they talk through the day's work and they talk about potential safety issues. But if this was a known factor, that the AD wasn't holding these safety briefings, I wonder why the line producer, or the production manager, or even the director didn't insist that the assistant director do that. The AD works for those people. So those people who are above the AD in the employment chain of command could have insisted, David Halls, you have to have a safety meeting. And if he wouldn't do it, they could have taken action against him. So that's a simple but easy way to ask the question, who is really responsible? Now, the assistant director also, in my opinion, in my experience, can't easily veto an unsafe action. I can advocate against it. I can say, I'm concerned about this activity we want to do for these reasons. But that's two separate questions. First of all, am I, Paul Epstein, the assistant director, am I qualified to judge safety or not safety of a given thing? Now, I can say, sure, you're standing too close to the edge of a thing, as you could fall off, step away from the edge. That's common sense. I wouldn't want to be the one trusting me about whether or not this gun has been handled safely. I'm not a firearm expert. All I can do is turn to the armorer. All I can do is turn to the people who are the experts in these situations and try to make sure that they are enabled to do their jobs correctly. But I can't necessarily judge if the guns have been loaded or unloaded correctly. And I don't think the crew should be turning to the assistant director to say, is that gun safe? But to a certain degree, that responsibility is, by custom or practice, put on the assistant director. Things like car chases or fast driving, things with animals, even horses and dogs and that kind of thing. The assistant director is nominally in charge of making sure everybody stays safe. But I think that the role is limited to making sure everybody really uses common sense and that nobody tries to override or insist upon doing something that seems unsafe. But the assistant director can't simply say, stop, we're not going to do this thing. It's not like a fire inspector coming to somebody's workplace or a dance club or a bar and saying, I'm the fire inspector, you've exceeded the occupancy limit here, issuing you a fine, and if you do it again, we're going to shutter your business and close your business. The AD doesn't really have the ability to say, nope, I'm fining you, I'm shuttering the set today, we're not doing that. All the AD can really do is make a very forceful case to everybody and say, this is why I think this is unsafe. And that's why I think what's lost in the conversation about Rust is how much responsibility the AD can and should take on. I will say, in all of the countless deal memos and employment contracts I've signed as an assistant director over the years, dozens of them, I don't think any one of them ever said as an employment clause, you agree to be responsible for the safe operations of the film set, and with any description of that. It doesn't really say that anywhere. It's just accepted as a common accepted practice on productions that that's the AD's role. The Directors Guild of America, of which I am a member, they do have more deliberate and focused guidelines about that, and their kind of, their qualifications, procedures for qualifying a first AD. They offer training programs that are really kind of related to safety programs, and they're good and they're valuable and they're appropriate, but they don't actually qualify an assistant director to be a safety expert on firearm use or a safety expert on stunts. They just try to instill the habit of asking questions about the safety of things. But I think it's a very complicated gray area. I'll say one specific thing about this quickly. In a recent New York Times article, a reporter was reporting on the fact that Alec Baldwin's defense attorneys are trying to get the trial dismissed. And they're doing so because they think they accuse the prosecutors of prosecutorial misconduct of various kinds. The minutiae of it isn't that important. But the report, the newspaper article, quotes part of a grand jury testimony in which a juror asks one of the detectives who investigated the shooting on the trial. So again, this New York Times report is about jury questioning about how the crime was investigated by detectives from New Mexico. And the juror wanted to clarify from the detective. So just to be clear, the responsibility was divided between the armorer and the assistant director, is that right? And the detective from Santa Fe basically said, we're going to have some other witness answer that question. So the detective is a woman who is actually investigating this manslaughter or possibly civil criminal liability case several months after the fact, isn't able to clearly say this person is responsible for this and this person is responsible for that. So I do think it's very telling that if a detective assigned to investigate what happened in the Rust shooting goes through all the usual crime scene investigative processes, isn't able to adequately explain who is responsible for gun safety on the set, how do you divide the responsibility between the armorer and the assistant director? If the detective can't tell, how can the rest of us tell? And I think that's something that probably, as we talk more and more about Rust, I think that it'd be well worth it for more people to talk about and think about when it comes to overall set safety. And I do want to say something quickly about set safety in general. We've been talking quite a bit about Rust. It's a terrible tragedy. It's an unbelievably heartbreaking tragedy. It defies description and it defies imagination. And we talk about it a lot because of a couple of things. First and foremost, because it has a big name celebrity, but also because it's got guns involved. In the United States, guns are an issue of interest and concern to almost everybody. And also because it is such a freak accident. The narrative of events is irresistibly compelling because it's so tragic. But when it comes to set safety, the use of firearms is only one of dozens and dozens of things that fall under the umbrella of safety on any given film set on any day. Film TV productions are much different than the jobs that most people have in the rest of the world, who perhaps work in offices or work in restaurants, work behind counters, from home. Maybe they drive, maybe they have various kinds of jobs. On a film set, a daily routine involves things that are like moderately risky, like loading heavy equipment on and off of trucks and putting up relatively heavy lighting equipment, suspending it and ringing it from ceilings or overhead. Having actors run up and down stairs or run around places and things, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a stunt per se. You have people that are doing things in which they could accidentally get hurt in various ways, but they're doing it while they're also concentrating on something else all the time. So when the camera operator, the Steadicam operator, is trying to track along and get that great shot of the hero running down a flight of stairs has a risk factor of, we'll say, 2. Running down the flight of stairs when you're not paying attention and you're focused on something else is risk factor of whatever, 5. It's higher. Yeah. And so films do that all the time. TV shows do that all the time. And so the management of the set and making sure that's all done correctly and safely, again, to a large degree, falls on the AD's shoulder. And the AD in that scenario can say, look, let's do 1 or 2 more dry runs. Let's let the Steadicam operator walk up and down the stairs 2 or 3 more times, just get used to it. But if they're in a hurry, if the director says, no, the actor is primed and ready, the actor's hot, let's go right now. The Steadicam operator's like, nah, I got it. Don't worry about it. I've been doing this for 50 years. When the scenario where somebody else on the set doesn't take the safety as seriously as the AD who's trying to say, slow down, let's practice, the safety level, the risk factor rises. And that happens constantly all the time on film sets everywhere. So I'm not trying to say that every production is inherently unsafe, but I am saying that every production inherently has most likely higher risk factors than the jobs of people who are sitting at their computer day by day. And when you go to your workplace, wherever it is, your building has safety codes, they have fire safety procedures, they have occupancy codes, they have buildings are inspected. If you work in a restaurant, restaurants are inspected by health and safety inspectors. If you drive a car for a living, you probably have to make sure your car is inspected, your truck, whatever that is. There really isn't a safety inspector who comes to a film set and makes sure that everything that is happening, oh yeah, that what the Steadicam operator, that's going to be safe. That's going to be safe. Yes, these lights have been hung correctly from the ceiling. That's going to be safe. Having the actor lean this far out the window and yell at a person on the street without having a safety rig or something, yes, that's safe enough. No third party is paying attention to that kind of thing. So even if the risk factor is not as high as it would be when it comes to Mission Impossible, I'm jumping a motorcycle over a moving train like over and over again. It's extraordinarily sensational high risk. They pile safety on top of that. I'm sure it's as safe as it could possibly be. On a low budget film, when you have your character just got dumped by his girlfriend, is going to go sit on the fire escape and moodily strum his guitar and maybe lean on the edge of the fire escape. Is he leaning back too far? Is the fire escape safe enough? Is he so high that if he fell, he'd be badly injured? Nobody's really paying attention to that beyond necessarily the common sense of the crew and the AD. And so that's the kind of risk that creeps into almost every production that I think is not necessarily monitored closely enough, except by your ever dutiful ADs who are tasked with this, even though they may not have the expertise, they may not have the full backing and support of the other people that should be giving them support and backing.
Paul, that is so much information for us to all learn from, and hopefully we will execute perfect health and safety on our own sets as filmmakers, independent filmmakers. And it's been a pleasure having you come on. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me and for us to learn about all that happened in Rust, the sad story that occurred there.
I'm glad you had the opportunity to talk to you about it. I think it's something that we all in the industry should be talking about. We should be thinking about. And again, recognizing that safety is everybody's responsibility. In the case of the Rust trial, everybody's trying to assign responsibility to specific people. All of us making content, either our own or for TV show, film, whatever your content making interest is, the responsibility starts with you. And you need to share that with as many people as you possibly can. That's the message.